Are you sitting comfortably? Yes. Then I'll begin. Once upon a time, about 40,000 years ago, there was a little Homo sapien. Maybe he was on a mammoth hunt or something. And he came back and he started talking about what he had experienced. This is at least what we hypothesize about how stories actually got going. But the interesting point is that Homo sapiens, our species, we're the storytelling species. We tell each other stories. So what has been discovered recently is that evolutionary biologists have discovered that it's an adaptation. The fact that we tell each other stories is an adaptation, meaning that we have an evolutionary advantage from telling each other stories. And listening to stories. So the next time that someone gets at you for watching some Hollywood blockbuster, thinks that you're doing something trivial or unimportant, it's not true. What you're doing is surviving. So we tell each other stories, and it has helped us to survive. The Neanderthaler is no longer with us, but we are here, and that's because we tell each other stories. So it's important. Now, how does it actually work, storytelling? Well, before I get into it, let me dispel two popular myths, things that you often read in the how-to books on how to become a writer. One popular myth is the hero, the protagonist, has to be the most fascinating character. This is not necessarily true. It might be true if you're writing Hamlet, but it's not true if you're writing Harry Potter. Harry Potter, him in himself, is not really very interesting, is he? Think about it. He's really quite dull. Hermione is interesting. Voldemort is interesting. Snape is interesting. But Harry Potter, is he interesting? Not that interesting, really. What about Luke Skywalker? Luke Skywalker is not so interesting as a character. Han Solo is interesting. Now, why is this so? The thing is, these not so idiosyncratic characters, the characters that are these protagonists, they offer the broadest space for projection. So the people for all over the world can identify with aspects of what the story that they're going through, can project themselves into it. So it's about us, the recipients, really, more than about the characters themselves. So this is a myth that's not necessarily true. The other myth is stories are about what happens next. The reason why we keep on reading a book or watch a movie is because we want to know what happens next. This is kind of true, but not necessarily, because think about it. When you the old stories like the Greeks famously told each other, Oedipus Rex and Sophocles, Euripides, stuff like that. When people were watching these dramas back then, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, people knew these stories already. They weren't new to them. They knew what was going to happen next. They knew how the story was going to end. And basically, when you watch that Hollywood blockbuster, you pretty much know, after 10 minutes of watching that movie, you know what's going to happen next. You know how it's going to end, don't you? And you still keep watching. So what happens next is not really the most important factor in storytelling. Possibly the most important factor in storytelling is cause and effect. And that's why I use this little bridge here, a Roman bridge, to illustrate that. You can build one of these in the Technik Museum in Berlin, in the Spektrum. You have these little blocks, and you can build one of these. I encourage anyone to do that. It's really quite fun, because you have to do it collaboratively. You can't do it on your own. The point is that every scene in a story kind of builds on each other. So every scene is like has a particular shape, and it has to have exactly that shape in order to fit into the whole story structure. And that cause and effect. We're going to get to why that's important in a minute. But that causes an experience, and it causes an experience within us. And this experience is real. People like to call it visceral. Like when we're watching a movie or reading a really good book, your heart starts to race, your palms are sweating, you might get aroused or something like that. So it's a physical experience. Going through a story is a physical experience. And this is the point, like when those Homo sapiens were sitting around the campfire telling each other stories, it wasn't just intellectually in their heads, yeah? It wasn't just that they were hearing about the woolly mammoth chasing this guy and how he escaped. It was something that they were sitting around the campfire and their hearts were beating. They shared this experience. And experience is how we learn. And that's what storytelling is all about learning and about problem solving. And if you look at stories, any and all stories, they effectively have these elements. You can call them by different names, but they have these are the constituent parts of how stories work. And the first thing is a problem. Stories are always about problems. If you don't have a problem, a character going through a problem, or several characters going through problems, then there's no real story. If everything's easy for them, it's not a story. And it ends, I've written the word change here. You could say the word development, or you could say the word learning. Yeah? The change is a change in the character's state, or something that the character has learned, and actually the character isn't even really the important part. The important part is the experience that you, as a recipient of the story, have had. Yeah? So the viewer or the reader of a book has gone through an experience and has learned through this experience and has thus been changed. And that's what storytelling is really about. In the middle, you see something I've written as obstacles here. You could, if you wanted to, write the word antagonism in there too. But before we go into the details of how all that works, and especially about the shape of it, which may be a coincidence that it's a shape, how are stories actually written? This guy here, this is a room that William Faulkner was in for a while, a hotel room that he wrote a story in. And you notice that on the wall, there's all these little notes. This is his structure for the story that he wanted to write. This is William Faulkner at his typewriter writing a story. Anyone recognize that? This is Catch-22. Joseph Heller's notes for Catch-22. This is the typewriter and the desk that Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22 on. Anyone recognize that? This is J.K. Rowling's note for how the first Harry Potter volume works structurally. And this is J.K. Rowling writing. So what I'm getting at is that there are two processes. The one thing is the text, yeah? An author obviously needs to be able to write, yeah? Formulate sentences that are beautiful and full of truth. That's the one thing. But the other thing is the story building, like how to construct a plot that works and characters that do what they're supposed to do, that work emotionally. Now, this is my little plug for the little bit of advertising that I'm allowed here. If you want to write, there's plenty of software you can do it with. If you want to outline, if you want to plan a story, there isn't that much software. What there is beamg.com. I encourage you all to have a look at it. Outlining and writing. Now, we notice here that outlining, planning a story, is about characters and it's about plot. Every story, it's inconceivable to have a story which does not have characters. It always has characters. They might not be people, they might be rabbits or robots or whatever, but you do have characters. And you have things that they do, the plot. Now, in German, this works really well. Das Handeln und die Handlung. Yeah? The characters do stuff, and that makes the plot. So really and truly, characters and plot are actually the same thing, because what the characters do is the plot. On the other side, we have language, so text, the beautiful sentences of, or if you're talking about different media, like the language of film, or the way that is made, the way that it's told, and meaning. Is it trivial or is it high art? Does it express something that's an inner truth, or does it just tell a simple story? This is something that we're not talking about today. The only thing that we're talking about, that I want to talk about here, is characters and plot on the left side. So basically, we're talking about what you tell versus how you tell it. So getting back to that bridge, getting back to that the arc of a story and the elements that a story consists of. So the first thing that we had on our list was the problem. Now you notice that if a story is about problem solving, yeah, you notice that we have two different problems here. The first thing is let's call it the surface structure of a story. So any story starts off with a problem at the beginning. You can see it really well in classical crime stories, where you have the detective sitting in his office, and then someone comes in with a case. And this case is a problem that is external to the character's true inner being. Yeah, it's a case that triggers off the whole bulk of the story. Yeah? It's in film parlance, it's called the inciting incident. But you see also that there's an internal problem. And the internal problem is what gives the story its deep structure and its resonance, because this character, the detective in our example, has some kind of flaw, has some kind of something that doesn't really work, or that makes him antisocial, for example, or that there's something that he needs to correct. Yeah? And that's what we can call the internal problem. Now, either way, I mean, if we're just talking about something like James Bond is more external. Yeah, it doesn't concentrate so much on internal problems like the psychology or emotional problems or what James Bond has to learn. And when they do try to do that in the films, it tends to be a bit not really what we want to see. But good stories tend to have like this double structure. Either way, you want. A character needs to want something. And what the character wants basically is to solve the problem. Initially, the external problem, eventually they realize they have to solve the internal problem too. They want something, and it's important to think of this, what they want, as separate from the goal. The goal is what they set themselves, yeah, as what they need to achieve, what they think they need to achieve in order to achieve what they, in order to get what they want. Yeah? Then the story gets going, and the obstacles start. And there's many different sorts of obstacles. The external, you have the antagonistic obstacles are possibly the most important. Also the internal obstacles within the character. There's the bulk of the story is here in the middle. And then you come towards the point which people know as the crisis, which is the confrontation. At this point, often there's a choice, a moral choice, that the character has to make. Now, this might seem a bit simplistic and like a template, but it's if you look at any work of fiction, essentially they have these ingredients. Yeah? Whether we're talking about the Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Star Wars, or whether we're talking about Ulysses, or Faulkner novels, or Nabokov, yeah? You'll see these things in there. You'll see this structure in there. Now, one of the most important aspects is the revelation that comes to the character at the point of crisis, where the character actually has this learning moment that I was talking about. Yeah? The interesting thing is that this revelation might come at 2 points. Either it comes right there at the crisis point, or, and this is actually the more clever way of doing it, is put it in the middle, at the midpoint, and then the character doesn't really act on it immediately because he can't really assimilate it, and doesn't really accept that the point that the character has to change until the crisis at the end. And the midpoint is perhaps my favorite part of all stories because they're so cool. They're such cool midpoints. For instance, in the story of Titanic, what is the key incident in the story of Titanic? It's yeah, ship and iceberg. When does that happen in James Cameron's film? In the middle. What is the scene that everyone remembers in that horror movie Alien? It's like, bleh, yeah? It's where the alien comes out of the guy's stomach. And that's right in the middle. Yeah? And there's a reason for that. You can see it kind of structurally because stories, and this is kind of a secret, not that many people write about this, stories are symmetrical. They hinge on this midpoint. They pivot on this midpoint. In Star Wars, in the original Star Wars, the midpoint is where Luke Skywalker finds the princess. Yeah? And after that, it becomes about, the whole story becomes about what the consequences are of him finding the princess, of him getting what he wants. And Lolita is the same. Yeah? Lolita is interesting because the midpoint is where the mother dies in an accident, and this is actually a coincidence. This is not something that you normally do in storytelling. Pixar has a rule for their screenwriters about coincidence. They say it's good to start a story with a coincidence, but you must never end it with a coincidence, because that's Deus ex machina, and that's doesn't come from within the story itself. And this is kind of the point, because stories are not like life. Stories have cause and effect. And this is something that we don't see in our ordinary everyday life. What we see in our ordinary everyday life is kind of chaos, but we can't really cope with the chaos. And that's why Homo sapiens started to tell each other stories in order to give their lives a sort of a meaning and a hope that there is some kind of reason behind the randomness that they experience all around them. And that's one of the reasons why we have storytelling in the first place. So, is this some kind of new theory that I'm telling you here? Not really. It's all of this with the story arc fits in very well with Aristotle, with what he said in the Poetics about stories are thesis, antithesis, and synthesis of the two. Yeah? And that fits in very well with the much maligned 3-act structure that Hollywood works with, or that every tart art works with. Like, basically says that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yeah. One more point is that we're talking about the protagonist here. Some stories have more than just one protagonist. Yeah, they might be ensemble pieces, but every character in something like Manhattan by Woody Allen or Pulp Fiction, the characters that you have in these stories, they each have one of these arcs. So start to look out for that the next time you watch a movie or you read a book. You'll find these elements in there somewhere. There's a whole lot more that we could talk about, but I'll spare you all of that. One last thing though, where is our Homo sapien? Well, by now, he's online and mobile. Where he is on his character arc, I have no idea. Thank you very much.